Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that half the people you know are dead. Your neighbour, your priest, your children. Gone. Not in a war, not in a famine, but from an invisible enemy that no one could see, no one could explain, and no one could stop. In just a few years, this killer erased a third of the entire human population of Europe. This is the story of the Bubonic Plague, the most devastating pandemic in recorded human history. There have been many great disasters in human history, wars, famines, floods. But nothing comes close to what the Bubonic Plague did to the medieval world. Between 1347 and 1351, it swept across an entire continent like a slow, unstoppable wave of death. Cities were emptied, entire villages disappeared. Mass graves swallowed thousands at a time. And when it was finally over, the world that was left behind was almost unrecognizable from the one that had existed before. But the Bubonic Plague wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point. It cracked open the foundations of medieval society, the church, the feudal system, the old economic order, and forced humanity to rebuild from the ruins. In a strange and brutal way, the Black Death helped create the modern world. To understand how, we have to go back to the very beginning. The story starts not in Europe, but in the wild grasslands of Central Asia, somewhere near the steppes of modern-day Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Scientists analysing ancient DNA have traced the earliest confirmed outbreak to cemeteries dating back to around 1338, nearly a decade before Europe ever heard the word plague. Tombstones in that region, written in a Syriac script, record an unusual number of deaths in a short period of time. Something was already killing people long before the world knew what was coming. The culprit was a bacterium, a tiny rod-shaped microorganism called Yersinia pestis, named much later after the French-Swiss bacteriologist Alexandre Yersin, who identified it in the 1890s. But in the 14th century, no one had any idea that bacteria even existed. The world had no microscopes, no germ theory, and no antibiotics. The cause of the plague was completely invisible to everyone who suffered from it. Here is how the disease actually moved. Yersinia pestis lived primarily in the bloodstreams of small rodents, wild rodents on the steppe, like marmots and gerbils, who had developed a partial tolerance to it over thousands of years. Fleas fed on these animals, and when the bacterium reached high enough concentrations in a flea's gut, it blocked the flea's digestive system entirely. The flea became ravenous, starving. It bit constantly, animals, humans, anything it could find, and with every bite, it regurgitated infected blood directly into the wound. That was the mechanism, a tiny jumping insect, smaller than the head of a pin, carrying enough bacteria to kill a grown man within days. As trade routes expanded across Asia, especially with the rise of the Mongol Empire, which connected China to the Middle East and Europe, rats and their fleas travelled with merchant caravans, along rivers and on ships. The plague moved with commerce. It followed the Silk Road westward. It reached the Crimean Peninsula by the late 1340s. And there, it found its bridge into Europe. In 1346, a Mongol army laid siege to the city of Kaffa, a trading port on the Black Sea in what is now Crimea, controlled by Genoese merchants. The siege dragged on, and then the Mongol forces began to die, not in battle, but from plague. According to one account by an Italian notary named Gabriele de Musi, the Mongols began catapulting their own infected corpses over the city walls, hoping to poison the defenders. Whether this biological warfare actually spread the disease or not, the Genoese merchants fled Kaffa by ship. They carried the plague with them. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors aboard were dying or already dead. Their bodies were covered in black, oozing swellings the size of eggs, weeping blood and pus. The port authorities ordered the ships out of the harbour immediately, but it was already too late. The plague was ashore. From Sicily, it moved to mainland Italy. By early 1348, it had reached Florence, Venice and Genoa. By summer, it was in France, Spain and England. By 1349, Germany, Scandinavia and Poland were burning. In less than 4 years, the disease had crossed an entire continent. The speed of it was staggering. In some cities, it killed faster than bodies could be buried. Florence lost somewhere between half and 2/3 of its entire population. Venice lost 3/4. In Avignon, then the seat of the Catholic papacy, the death toll was so extreme that the Pope consecrated the Rhone River itself so that bodies could be thrown into it and still receive a Christian burial. In the English village of Ayam, in the small French village of Givry, in towns and hamlets from the Mediterranean coast to the Baltic Sea, the pattern was the same. A town of several thousand people would be reduced to a few hundred within weeks. Carts rolled through streets before dawn, the driver calling out for people to bring out their dead. Entire families were wiped out overnight. Survivors woke to find their parents, siblings and children cold beside them. The chronicler Jean de Venette described the scene in France this way. Vineyards went unpruned, fields went unharvested, and the lamenting cries of those left behind could be heard from village to village. People were so afraid of the sick that they refused to visit their own dying relatives. Priests refused to administer last rites. The social bonds that held communities together, family, faith, neighbourly duty, began to dissolve under the weight of terror. Some people responded with desperate revelry, believing that since death was certain, pleasure was the only reasonable response. Others flagellated themselves in public processions, whipping their own bodies bloody in a frantic attempt to appease what they believed was the wrath of God. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew why. And that uncertainty may have been the most terrifying thing of all. The disease came in 3 forms. Bubonic plague, the most common, began with a flea bite. Bacteria travelled to the nearest lymph node, causing it to swell into a blackened oozing lump called a bubo, sometimes growing to the size of an apple. High fever, vomiting and crushing headaches followed. Within 3 to 7 days, most people were dead. Septicemic plague was faster, entering the bloodstream directly, killing within hours. Pneumonic plague was the most dangerous of all, spreading through the air simply by breathing near an infected person. Medieval doctors were helpless. They blamed bad air, wore herb-stuffed beak masks, and bled their patients. Nothing worked. The Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, up to 200 million people worldwide. When the dying stopped, the survivors inherited a broken world. Farms were abandoned, fields went unplanted. The labour shortage that followed had an unexpected consequence. Workers gained power. Wages rose. Serfs began to refuse their obligations. The feudal system started cracking from within. The church, unable to explain or stop the carnage, lost its moral authority, an erosion that would eventually help spark the Protestant Reformation. Art turned dark. The danse macabre, skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike, became the defining image of the age. The plague didn't end suddenly. It faded slowly as the disease outran its own hosts. Winters slowed flea activity, and survivors developed some resistance. Venice introduced the world's first formal quarantine, requiring ships to anchor offshore for 40 days before docking. The Italian word for 40, quarantina, gave us the word we still use today. But the plague kept returning. It struck England again in 1361. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed a quarter of the city. A third global pandemic in the 1850s killed over 12 million in India alone. It was during that outbreak that scientist Alexandra Yersin finally identified the bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, giving humanity its first real look at the enemy. Today, plague still exists. It still circulates in wild rodents across Madagascar, Central Africa, and even parts of the American West. But antibiotics now cure it, with a survival rate above 90% when treated early. The disease hasn't changed. What changed is us. 50 million dead, generations erased, and yet from that devastation came the end of feudalism, the questioning of religious authority, the birth of quarantine, and the first steps toward modern medicine. The people who died in those mass graves had no idea what their suffering would set in motion. But every antibiotic that saves a life today carries their shadow. We are living in a world the plague helped make. And that is the story of the plague that changed the world. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. See you in the next one.